Hello everyone, this is Yana Smakula. Welcome back for another Yippee for Yana episode. In this video, we're looking at coloring with Copic markers, and we're going to explore the flick stroke Copic marker coloring technique to color beautiful florals. Today, I'm working with a fabulous stamp set from Simon Says Stamp. This is the Pixie Dust set. And here I have my Misty stamping tool, my Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock. I'm using Memento Tuxedo Black ink, and I'm stamping the beautiful floral image onto the paper. I'm going to stamp this twice just to have a nice dark black impression on my paper. The reason I chose this particular ink is, as I already mentioned, we will be coloring with Copic markers. These are alcohol markers, and we need to make sure our ink is not going to bleed when it is going to come in contact with the markers. Here I have a test panel. Whenever I plan to do some coloring, I like to stamp my image and practice coloring it just so that I'm confident with the technique and confident with the colors that I'm going to use. So this was my practice sheet, and we're going to go ahead and start coloring our main image. I'm going to zoom in and show you everything up close. I'm starting with my lightest color. This is RV11, and I'm applying the color onto the petals in flicks. I am not coloring the entire petal. I'm not saturating the entire petal with marker. Instead, I'm adding color using a flicking motion onto the paper. I envision where the petal would be darker. I envision where there would be folds in the paper, and I'm not only adding color with my marker, but I'm also creating texture using those flicks. I am keeping the center portion of the petal light or white or free from color, as this is where I want the highlight to be. Next, I have R85. This is my medium color, and I'm repeating the same steps, but my strokes are shorter. I'm not extending them as far into the petal as I did with the previous color. Again, I try to imagine where I have the folds in the petal, where I have the little details, and I add those with my marker. The last color, the darkest color here for this color combination is R89. This is a very dark color. This is a dark red, and I'm using this to create shading. So I have three very contrasting colors here, R11, R85, and R89. I will also use the RV00 as a very light, very pale color to blend these colors in some instances on some petals. So you can see that this gives us a very different looking petal with a lot of dark, vibrant red and just a little bit of color in the center where there is a highlight. This is my preferred method for coloring petals or for coloring flowers, is this gives a more realistic look. This also makes it easier to color when you have a larger petal, because when you do the circular coloring, sometimes it's hard to keep the entire surface, the entire area wet for a prolonged period of time, depending on how large the petal is. If you're coloring a small flower, yes, you can definitely use that method. But whenever I'm coloring a flower that is larger, this is the method that I reach for. I also used a yellow marker. This was Y19, and I added yellow strokes to my petal. I wanted to mix the colors slightly. I didn't want to have just a red-pink petal. I wanted it to have a little bit of yellow just because, there are flowers like that in real life. There are petals like that in real life, and I wanted to have a little bit of color variation added to my petals. I'm going to speed this portion of the video up and show you some more of the coloring process. But basically, this is all the same. I'm starting with the lightest color. I'm adding the longest flicks, then coming in with my medium color, adding slightly shorter flicks, and finishing with the darkest color, and I'm creating the shadows for the petal. I do go back to the lighter color and sometimes to the medium color to work on the flicks and work on adding more color, depending if that particular petal needs that. This is a very fun technique and a fun method, a fun way to color petals, and I encourage you to give this a try if you haven't yet tried it. The more you practice, the easier it's going to be to add flicks. And by the way, the key to adding flicks, at least for me, is to use the brush tip of your Copic marker. You can also use other alcohol markers. You don't have to limit yourself to Copics. If you have alt new markers or other brand markers, for example, you can try to recreate this technique using those markers as well. So any alcohol markers should work for this. If you have a hard time deciding where the folds and the petals should be, I encourage you to look on the website, see if there are some colored examples in this Simon Says Stamp shop, and try to copy that at first. The more you practice, the more you color, the easier it's going to be for you later on. Now, to color the flower center, I once again mixed my reds and the yellow, and I also added a dark gray to create an almost black flower center. So I started with the yellow, then I added a little bit of red. Here I'm coming in with the R89. I'm trying to blend these colors. So this area is smaller, and I am working in that circular blending motion because I can maintain this area wet, so I don't need to do flicks. Also, the circular blending technique works better here. As for the little stamens that are surrounding the flower center, I colored those using a yellow and a pink marker. I did not do a lot of blending. I basically just dabbed the color to make them colorful. Next, I used a C10, C7, and a CE5 Copic marker, so these are cool grays, to darken that center and make it more dimensional, if you will. So here I'm coming in with my markers, coming in with R89 and R85 and blending those together. Now, as for the leaves, I went back to the flick technique. Here I'm starting with the darkest. This is YG67, and you can see how I am adding this color onto the leaf. So with this technique, sometimes I like to start with the lightest color. Other times I like to come in with the darkest color. It just depends on the image that I'm trying to color. If I start with the darkest color and I move on to the lightest color, I feel like this gives me sometimes better results because I can preserve a better highlight or have more control where I have the shadows. But sometimes with the petals, I like to start with a lighter color, and then with the leaves, I like to start with the darkest color. It just depends on the image that I'm coloring, and I don't think that there is a right or a wrong way to go about it. So my green markers are YG67, YG17, and YG03. These are my go-to greens. I seem to use them anytime and every time I color leaves or grass or any type of greenery on my cards. So here is a look at the finished image. It's all nice and colored. I'm going to use my coordinating die and cut it out. I also cut out my test piece just because I wanted to back my image up with another layer of cardstock. And here I'm using barely art glue and going to stick the two layers together so that I have one sturdy die cut. I will be foam mounting this onto my card, so I need this to be a little bit sturdier. Next, I created a card base in A2 top folding using white cardstock. I also have a white cardstock panel. This is cut to 4 by 5 1/4 inches, and I'm going to add some ink blending and some very faint stamping. I'm using flannel positively saturated ink from Simon and a blending brush, a large blending brush, and I'm adding color just to the bottom left-hand side of this panel. So I don't want this to be completely gray. I also don't want this to be completely white. I want there to be, a slight variation in color. Next, I have an old letter stamp from Simon, and I'm going to use the same flannel ink and just gently stamp this onto my ink blended background. I inked my stamp up once, and I pressed it down onto the paper carefully. I wasn't trying to have a perfect impression. I was just going for an old letter look. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. And it turned out fabulously. Next, I have Spellbinder's Spatter White product. This is a very highly pigmented white liquid product that I like to use to add white spatter onto my cards. So here I have a water brush. This is my dedicated water brush for this particular product, and I'm going to use to pick up some of that product and just add some splatter dots onto the background to create interest, to add texture, to add something else, something additional and more interest. I had a water drop on my work surface, on my mat, and I noticed how that water seeped onto my paper and how that pushed the ink away from the ink blended area. I decided to keep that. I kind of liked that look. Other times I probably would have scrapped this panel and created a new one because I don't typically like that look of water pushing the ink away from the paper. But in this particular case, because I was going for that old letter background, I kind of like that and I let it be. I let it sit. I set this panel aside and I let it dry for a little bit. In fact, I used my Glimmer hot foil system. This is my trick. So I have the Glimmer, I turn it on, I set my panels on top of the Glimmer, and I let the heat from the Glimmer dry whatever liquid, whatever ink I have on my panels. I also used a cloth and I basically just soaked up any residual splatter from the panel. Next, I used double-sided tape. This is Altnu double-sided foam tape, and I foam mounted the panel onto the card. I have also added double-sided foam squares to the back of my die cut. I'm going to add some additional foam strip to the stem area and foam mount this onto the card. My image is larger than my card. Well, maybe if I center it, it's not larger, but because I want it off to the side slightly, I do have one of the leaves going outside the edges of my card, and I kind of like that. I like that offset design. I also trimmed the stem off, and now I'm using a pre-printed sentiment and foam mounting that over my floral. Now the sentiment comes from the Everyday Easy strips from Kathy Zelski and Simon Says Stamp. So these are the pre-printed cardstock sentiment strips. And then I use the Easy strips rectangles, wafer dies, also from Simon Says Stamp, to cut those out. I store mine in these container craft stacks from Spellbinders, and they are super convenient because I have a bunch of them ready to go and I can just add one quickly onto the card. Finally, I'm using sequins. These are the Aura sequins from Spellbinders. They seem to be the perfect color and go really well with the card design. And I'm just going to add a couple of here and there, and that finishes my card. So here's a look at the finished project featuring the flick stroke Copic marker technique. I hope I've inspired you to give this idea a try. Grab this stamp set or another floral set you have in your stash and experiment with your Copic markers to see if you can color your flowers to look like this. Thanks so much for joining me today. Love you guys, and I'll see you again next time.